This is the third program in our series, Views of Japan. Last spring, we had a program on African views of Japan, and then a second program was European views of Japan. And our goal here is to, because so many people in Washington, when we think about Japan, we think about U.S.-Japan relations, and we thought it was very important to introduce the viewpoint of other regions and how other regions are looking at Japan. So we have a very exciting panel today and very limited time, so I'm going to not talk much longer, but just wanted to welcome you here and turn things over to Satu Lemay, who's going to be doing our program for us. Thank
Wonderful.
you, Satu.
Thank you, Ambassador Zumwalt. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's an absolute delight to be here and to coordinate with our friends at Sasakawa USA, and of course my colleagues here who are doing the main work of the panel. You have the bios of each of the speakers, so I won't belabor it. They bring a tremendous amount of expertise in the region and in their respective countries, as well as in government and other affairs. So please read their bios fully, but they'll forgive me if I don't take the time, because I really think I want to maximize their input. What we're going to do is just go down in the order that's on your program, starting with Ms. Willett, who of course has had 20 years almost in the US government. She managed the Southeast Asia account for the Obama administration on the National Security Council most recently. So she's really well placed to give us a perspective not only of the US, but how the US worked with Japan in Southeast Asia. And then we'll go through and I'll ask them a few questions before opening it up for Q&A. So welcome, everyone, and please enjoy this terrific program. Colin, why don't you start off, please?
Great, thank you. First, I just want to make crystal clear, I am not a current U.S. government official. I'm a former U.S. government official, so I can't speak for the Trump administration. I come at this as someone who has worked on Southeast Asia, on ASEAN, for almost 20 years in the government. This is actually the first East Asia Summit that the United States has participated in that I wasn't on the delegation, so I might be a little bit biased in how I look at things. But I'm coming at this as someone who's spent a lot of time working on the East Asia Summit, on our alliances, on ASEAN, on multilateralism in general in East Asia. I'll be really brief. I just wanted to hit a couple of my key takeaways from the trip. And I think in some ways the trip was, for me at least, remarkable more for what didn't happen than what did. I don't think there was a lot that was really unexpected or new. But overall, I think, particularly for President Trump, the trip was one of very sort of positive optics. I think he had very good stops in all 6 of the cities he visited, which I have to admit is a remarkable achievement in and of itself. I think the interactions that he had in Northeast Asia, his comments on North Korea, his remarks on the security situation in Northeast Asia were largely very balanced, very measured, and I think very reassuring to most people in the region. Not surprisingly, we had an overwhelming focus on trade and a very, I would say, transactional approach to trade, but I do think that we got a lot more clarity on how President Trump looks at the issue of international trade, and particularly in Asia. Unfortunately, I think that the focus on trade meant that attention to sort of some of the big security issues that have usually played very strongly in these engagements largely were sort of relegated to sort of the bottom of the fact sheets. South China Sea, some of the maritime issues, some of the environmental issues that tend to really be more prominent at these engagements really took a backseat and were sort of addressed in a very perfunctory way, which I think will be frustrating to some folks who are looking for a little bit more clarity on how the administration is approaching its idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific region beyond just the question of trade and goods. South China Sea barely got a mention, and even as it was explicitly on the freedom of navigation and not on sort of the bigger, broader principles like the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which never actually came out of the president or any other senior official's mouth. Notably, I think the 2 things that did surprise me actually do reflect a shifting of the leadership, I think, not completely, but a little bit away from Washington and more towards Tokyo. and that was the Quad meeting that happened between the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. That is something that had happened once before. It's something that, in my experience, Tokyo has always been a big proponent of, and to have that happen this year, I think was a remarkable achievement, and I think something that could bear a great deal of fruit. And the second is the progress, I should say, on TPP. I did not expect for much to happen on TPP. I think, of course, we're nowhere near a final deal, but I think we did make, or I should say not we, because the United States is not in it anymore, but the TPP countries got a lot further on that road and showed much more determination than I was expecting on continuing to carry that process forward with the remaining 11 members. And I think that a lot of the credit for that goes to Japan for continuing to sort of be the standard barrier there. I think by and large, most of this was expected. I do think that the focus on trade, the way that the trade issue was addressed, doesn't raise a whole lot of eyebrows, but I do think that we're seeing an approach that, while not explicit, should be somewhat worrisome. It's this very, very transactional approach, and I think that that's not news. From day one, the Trump administration has had a very transactional approach to foreign affairs in general and trade in particular. But the fact that the way that it was laid out in the Da Nang speech, highlighting the tremendous, and very rightfully so, the tremendous economic achievements of Asia over the last several decades, but failing to sort of recognize that that achievement rests on a liberal world order based in sort of a multilateral approach to peace, security, and a rules-based order. And that, I think, disconnect, to some degree, is going to need to be addressed in the coming months. Trump and the administration are absolutely right that Chinese protectionism, the Chinese economic model, is distorting the international trade system. It is disadvantageous to most of the rest of the world. But the question about how you address that, the answer that we got in Da Nang was in a very sort of unilateral, zero-sum way. And I think that is giving up some of our leverage. And I think that we're all less effective if we're approaching things in a unilateral way on specific issues rather than adopting sort of a broader principled approach to the overall issue. But I don't want to take up too much time, so I will stop there.
Well, thank you very much. I didn't even have to use my highly sophisticated technological tool of the red pen when they're going over. Kay, you have a PowerPoint presentation,
right,
so
yeah.
you're up.
Okay.
And Colin has given you a couple extra minutes.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction, Satu. And then thank you very much. I would like to thank the Sasakawa USA for inviting me to the panel discussion, which is the post-summit evaluation, and then the Japan-US Southeast Asia relations. And I think these are the very timely and also the very interesting because there are many issues actually came up. And then one of these most important issues for Japan through these summits is what I found interesting is Japan's new regional vision, so-called the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And focusing on this the new regional strategy, I'd like to kind of evaluate if there is any change in Japan's the overall strategy toward the Southeast Asia, and how the Southeast Asia is located in this strategy, and also what institutions Japan would like to use to pursue this strategy. So before going into my evaluation, I just would like to introduce the basic kind of the Japanese strategies towards the Southeast Asia. I think there are two strategies. One is the conventional one, which is the traditional Japan has been pursuing. That has the two policies. The first one is the economic and then social cultural interactions. This is the oldest strategy Japan has toward the Southeast Asia. in the post-World War II period. And then economic interaction was actually pursued right after the World War II, but at the same time, Southeast Asian countries were skeptical about the Japanese intention, political intention in Southeast Asia because of the legacy of the World War II. And what happened was to respond this kind of skepticism, Japan created the so-called Fukuda Doctrine. The Prime Minister Fukuda issued the doctrine that tried to deepen the understanding of each other and then promote the heart-to-heart relationship. So that is actually get the heart and mind of Southeast Asia, and then Japan actually started to improve its relation with the Southeast Asian countries. And this actually has something to do with the economic and then also development assistance too. Secondly, the other policy was the more kind of strategic cooperation. This was particularly salient in the post-Cold War era. Japan actively supported the ASEAN's initiative for the multilateralism, and then the ASEAN's initiative to establish the security forum in East Asia, such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, and also the more recently the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. And then supporting these the ASEAN's multilateralism, Japan has respected the ASEAN's centrality, where the ASEAN is the center of the East Asian regionalism. So for that, Japan actually supported the ASEAN's multilateralism. At the same time, Japan also focused on the bilateralism too. Japan actually understands that there is certain kind of specific issues that each country has, and then in order to customize its policy toward each Southeast Asian country, they actually provided some particular economic assistance or the capacity building program. And then this is actually seen more recently to the Philippines and the Vietnam regarding Japan providing the patrol ships to these two countries, and then also beyond to the other countries like Malaysia. So these are the policies toward the ASEAN and then also each Southeast Asian states, and then these are the kind of the conventional strategy that Japan has. But the second one is the more kind of emerging strategy, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. It was coined by the Prime Minister Abe in 2016 when he made a speech in Kenya for the TICAD meeting. And then what happened was Japan started to kind of consider broaden its horizon and then try to reach out some of the countries outside the East Asia as well. The concept was still vague, but there are several principles. The first one is the geographical scope, which is from East Asia Pacific to the East Africa. And the second one is the maritime security, such as the freedom of navigation is one of the most important issues. And thirdly, the regional development strategy, the high quality infrastructure partnership that Japan has been pushing is should be again like incorporated in this strategy. And then fourthly, the core institution. This is still vague, but then Japan seems to include the major powers such as the United States, India, and Australia. So these are the kind of the two strategies that Japan is trying to merge. And then through this summit, I was kind of expecting some clarification of the Indo-Pacific strategy that Japan has. So I have like lots of slides, so I'm just going to skip because of the time constraint. So what happened? What I did was I went through the outcome of the 4 summits, which are the Japan-US Summit, APEC, Japan-ASEAN Summit, and the East Asia Summit. These are the summits Japan had in the Asia, and then I tried to kind of find out what was said by the Japan during the summit meeting. And then I had the four kind of main findings. The first one is the Japan's conventional strategy towards Southeast Asia in terms of the economic and development assistance is here to stay. It's not actually the mutually exclusive, even though the Japan said the Indo-Pacific strategy is the kind of the newly emerged strategy for the Japanese diplomacy. But then the still the economic assistance and then development assistance still here to stay. So each summit, Japan touched on these importance of them. And secondly, the concept of the Indo-Pacific strategy. When Japan had the meeting with the United States, it clarified the shared common kind of principle, which are threefold. The one is the promotion of establishment of fundamental values, and the second one is the pursuit of the economic prosperity, and third one is the commitment to peace and stability. And also adding to that, the Japan and the United States said this kind of strategy or this kind of the regional concept is open to any country. So they are not actually, they are trying to kind of be flexible in terms of the getting the Indo-Pacific strategy right. But at the same time, there was still unclearness of the strategy. The first of is a geographical scope. As I said, Japan was focusing on the region from the East Africa to the East Asia and Pacific. But then there was the statement by the US government saying Indo-Pacific actually enters the area from the India, and then to the India to the Asia Pacific. So there is some kind of differences in conceptualization. And also another issue is we are not still sure what kind of the institution we are going to focus on. As everybody or many said, maybe quadrilateral the cooperation between the Japan, Australia, United States, and India could be their core. But at the same time, then the ASEAN, which is located in the Indo-Pacific region, was actually left out, and then which is actually have some kind of implication to the ASEAN's role in the future. And this will also create the certain kind of concern among the ASEAN countries too. So this was actually need to be sorted out. And then finally, Japan actually faces difficulty in addressing the issues of the political values such as democratization, human rights, rules of law, and etc. The Indo-Pacific strategy has certain political value, and Japan wants to maintain U.S.-led actually the international order, rule-based international order, which used to be more kind of emphasized. Which emphasized some of the values I mentioned, the democratization and human rights. But if Japan pushed these kind of the values, then some of the ASEAN countries, like currently Myanmar and the Philippines, they might be kind of concerned about the Japanese new diplomacy. And also, if Japan is pushing forward some controversial issues, such as South China Sea issue in the ASEAN forums, then the ASEAN would be divided, and then that is going to be again concern for the Southeast Asia. So Japan was trying to balance out this kind of the controversial issues, but still, these are not really clear enough throughout the summits. So for the conclusion, I would say the Japanese policy or Japanese strategy towards Southeast Asia is more kind of the continuity than change, and then I think it takes more time to figure out what the Indo-Pacific strategy is all about, and then we will see the implication for Southeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Koga-san, thank you very much indeed. That was a lot of turf to cover on Japan's role, so we appreciate it. We now have the great benefit of having two specialists on Southeast Asia itself. One, Alex Vuving, our colleague from APCSS in Honolulu, and as it happens, Professor Patricio Abinales, also based in Hawaii at the University of Hawaii, and Alex focuses on Vietnam, and Professor Abinales focuses on the Philippines in particular, though they have wide-ranging Southeast Asia expertise. So Alex, may I invite you to give us 10, 12 minutes on sort of a Vietnamese look at the US and Japan role.
Thank you, Satu, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to save my comment on Trump's visit and TPP and Indo-Pacific to probably to second part when Satu goes with the Q&A. I think most of you are not very familiar with Vietnamese foreign policy, and I was also asked to provide some comments on Vietnamese foreign policy priorities. So what I'm going to do is to give it sort of a big picture of Vietnamese foreign policy priorities here. Whenever people ask me how to understand Vietnamese foreign policy, I would show them the 4 phases of Vietnamese politics. We probably won't see in a few minutes. So basically, there are Vietnam. We all know that it's a one-party system with the Communist Party rules, but behind the facade of a monolithic system, there are actually 4 major phases, 4 distinct phases of Vietnamese politics, particularly 4 distinct camps in the Vietnamese politics. The one, obviously, are the regime conservatives whose priority is to maintain the regime, maintain the rule of the party. But at the same time, even within the leadership in Vietnam, the ruling elite in Vietnam, there are also the nationalist modernizers who would put the country above the regime, so on the opposite side from the conservatives. And then, but these 2 groups, the conservatives and the modernizers, are not really the majority in the Vietnamese elite, the ruling elite, because in the last 3 or 4 decades, when Vietnam embarked on a reform process, there are more people who are in between. So we have the moderates who take the position in the middle of the road between the conservatives and the modernizers. And then also because of the cohabitation or the marriage of a authoritarian politics with capitalist economy, increasingly there are people who I would call rent seekers in, rent seekers in Vietnamese government and ruling elites who cares more about extracting benefits from the system. So for them, the regime or the state or the government or just their key tool in the get-rich-quick scheme for them. So we have these 4 major phases, if you will, or 4 major camps or factions within Vietnamese foreign politics. And so one of the characteristics of Vietnamese politics in the last 30 or 40 years of the Doi Moi or reform era is the mixture of the 4 phases. But we have seen here, this is from my paper that I published early this year, about the changing mixture of the 4 phases in Vietnamese politics. And we can see here the conservatives actually, the ratio of conservatives in the Politburo of the Communist Party of Vietnam went down from about 50% at the beginning of Doi Moi in the 1980s to less than 20% now. Also, the ratio of the modernizers also went down from about 40% to just about a little bit above 20% now. Now, the majority of of people in the Politburo are now moderates. They went from 10% at the beginning of the reform process to about 40% now. And then we also have the rent seekers with going up, becoming the dominant camp during the last decades or so, but now they represent just 20% of the Politburo members. Now, with this mixture of different ideologies in the Vietnamese ruling elite, we have these 4 major priorities of Vietnamese foreign policy. One is to gain access to foreign investment, to foreign finance and foreign market. And another priority is to maintain regional peace and stability, particularly in the South China Sea and along the Vietnamese borders with China and Laos, Cambodia. Then we have also the countering the China threat, countering Chinese threat of territorial expansion and economic dependence on China. So that is also one of the priorities for Vietnamese foreign policy. But also from the Vietnamese perspective, they also want to counter the US threat or Western threat of regime change. So that is their perception. And so we have these four major priorities. How do the Vietnamese rank order of these priorities? That's going to, causing a big headache for them because they have four different phases. Depending on who you are, if you are conservative, then your first priority would be countering the US threat and maintaining peace and stability. But if you are modernizers, then your first priority would be countering the China threat, but also getting access to foreign investment and market and finance. But if you are a moderate, then your first priority would be investment and peace and stability. But if you're a rent seeker, your first priority would tend to be investment in market. But then they can also support all sort of other priorities, whether they see the opportunity to get rich for themselves. So we have this kind of. So for the Vietnamese, the key one of the dilemmas of Vietnamese foreign policy is that you cannot fulfill one of these priorities without undermining one of the other priorities. For example, if you want to maintain peace and stability, then you also need to accommodate China. And if you accommodate China, then also you undermine your efforts to counter China's threat. And of course, the countering China threat also undercut the efforts to counter US threat and vice versa. However, the biggest dilemma in Vietnamese foreign policy is captured in the popular saying that I quote here: go with China and lose the country. Go with America and lose the party. So that's the biggest dilemma for the Vietnamese ruling elites, in addition to the other dilemmas that put Vietnam in a position that they have to hedge between China and the United States. And here's this chart I produced, for not just for Vietnam, but also other major countries in Southeast Asia. And you can see that Vietnam has been fairly trying to maintain, a position in between China and the United States for most of the times in the past after the Cold War. But one thing happened in the last 10 years or so. It's Chinese assertiveness in South China Sea, and so it really pushed the Vietnamese move, closer to the United States and farther from China. And the point of no return was in 2014 when China deployed the giant oil rig Haiyang Shiyu to water that Vietnam claimed that is easy. So the deployment of the oil rig has pushed the Vietnamese to cross the Rubicon in their relationship with China and with the United States, to move much closer to the United States rather than with China. So cross the equidistance line between China and the United States in their relationship with the two big powers. So much to the extent that earlier this year, in May this year, Prime Minister Nguyen Xuan Phuc from Vietnam was the first leader from Southeast Asia to visit the White House, to come to the White House to meet with President Trump. And Vietnam also was the first country in Southeast Asia to invite the new U.S. President Trump to Vietnam, which he did last week. So, this is very significant because for the last 20 years or so, it was always Singapore or the Philippines who led effort by Southeast Asia to engage with America. But now it's Vietnam, it's the Vietnamese. However, the Vietnamese, one is that they realize that America is indispensable for them, as a strategic partner, if they want to stand up to China. But at the same time, they also have to face with the uncertainty of in U.S. Policy as well as U.S. commitment to the region. The U.S. is indispensable if you want to stand up to China, but at the same time, U.S. is far away, and you're not sure about U.S. commitment to the region, and you also have all sort of issues with the U.S. commitment. At the same time, China is there, has been there for thousands of years, and will be there for another thousands of years. So the Vietnamese has to pursue a complex hedging policy in which they try to engage with both the great powers, both China and the United States. At the same time, they are pursuing what I would call middle power politics, reaching out to others who are key players in the region, including Japan, including India, Australia, Russia, and South Korea, and so on. But at the same time, Vietnam is one of the lead advocates of ASEAN centrality. So whenever they are, for example, when Trump visited Vietnam last week and they put out a joint statement, and the Vietnamese managed to put in there that both countries endorsed ASEAN centrality. So Vietnam is one of the lead advocates of ASEAN centrality as well. So you see here the different aspects of the complex hedging that Vietnam is pursuing, but at the same time, Vietnam has to pursue multiple balancing acts to cope with all of the dilemmas that they have. This chart, I don't know if you can see it, this chart would give you a sense of how the key players in Vietnamese foreign policy are ranked order according to different dimensions. So relationship here is the indicator is the title of the partnerships that Vietnam has signed or agreed with a partner. So China tops the list with a very long title of their partnership, Comprehensive Cooperative Strategic Partnership. And then we have Russia as a comprehensive strategic partner of Vietnam. And then we have Japan as a extensive strategic partnership. So this is very important because Japan has a special, outside of the bilateral defense treaty with the United States, Japan has a special strategic partnership with Australia. Japan has a special strategic and global partnership with India. And then Japan has multiple strategic partnerships with a lot of countries in the region, including but with Vietnam, they have already upgraded it to a extensive strategic partnership. So it means that the commitment that both countries maintain in their bilateral relationships is very, fairly high. Security-wise, I take this is an indicator of commitment between the two countries. Cam Ranh Bay is a very strategic military installation along the coast of the South China Sea, and all of militaries in the region wants to have access to Cam Ranh Bay. Now, the Vietnamese early in 2016 opened an international port for foreign navies to come in, visit, and get logistic issues. Now, once the Vietnamese opened the port, they invited Singapore first. And then the second country, the second military was Japan, followed by India. And then the U.S. Navy was the fifth and the sixth, and China's Navy was the seventh in that list of countries that Vietnamese invited to visit Cam Ranh Bay. Investment, you can see here, Japan is the first top the list of investors in terms of foreign direct investment. But trade, Japan was the top trading partner of Vietnam in the 1990s and early 2000s. I'm sorry. So you can see from here, but now it's lag far behind China and Korea and US and other countries as well. So in conclusion, I would say that Vietnam conducts a multiple balancing acts to hedge against all scenarios, but it's running out of options. And so, because the formula that had worked in the past 20 years or so is now useless for Vietnam. And so, like other countries in the region, Vietnam is now at the historical momentum, historical juncture where they have to seek and build new approaches to their foreign policy as well as regional security. And I stop here. Sorry.
Alex, that's wonderful. It's a very thought-provoking, and I had hoped we get a chance to get into it in some detail because your focus on the Politburo and the four schools of thought are an additional layer to what generally has been viewed as VCP versus government of Vietnam, and now the very interesting change in the dynamics of Vietnamese ministries, foreign ministry, defense, and the economic and trade portfolio in how Vietnam manages. So I hope we'll come back to a very rich presentation. Please, Professor Abenales.
I'd like to thank Sasakawa USA for inviting me. I had to reacquaint my clothing style away from, hula, aloha shirts and short pants to this kind. So the Philippines is the odd country in this discussion, in part mainly because it's a minor economic player in the trade and investment portrait in the region. So if it doesn't have that role, inevitably what the Philippines is a political, becomes, what the focus in the Philippines is would be the political question. And with political question, we often go to our very colorful president, Rodrigo Duterte, who was cursed President Obama when he was president, and now was recently described again by President Trump as a good man. That being said, it doesn't actually erase Duterte's anti-Americanism. So this is first centerpiece. Duterte has consistently been anti-American and wants to expand relationship with China and Russia. The reasons for this are very varied. It ranges from he's not getting a visa to visit his mistress in California, to the FBI and the U.S. Embassy suddenly pulling out this American bomb maker in Davao when Duterte was mayor without his permission, to the fact, to a more political reason, which is he belonged to a 60s generation where nationalism was very strong. So that, I think, informs Duterte's anti-Americanism. The question is what prevents him from pushing with it. The first is the Armed Forces of the Philippines. The Armed Forces of the Philippines has consistently pushed back any attempt by Duterte to reduce relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. It has agreed to ease on joint exercises, but on the crucial question of American support for anti-terrorist operations of the armed forces in the Philippine South, it has refused to, it has pushed back. The U.S. Army, the Philippine Army has also pushed back in terms of the efforts by Duterte to integrate Chinese resources and weaponry and even routines into the military structure. So a friend of mine would put it, the AFP is American in orientation, and that American orientation is part of its genetic structure. Okay? So military commanders then would accept Chinese weapons, but almost always would complain that they do not fit the kinds of needs that the military would have in order to contain terrorism in the South. And it expresses itself not openly, though. It's very respectful of the president, but you can see signs of it showing impish sides from the military, showing how much it's uncomfortable with Duterte's push for Chinese weapons. When Chinese turned over some of their sniper rifles to the Armed Forces of the Philippines a couple of weeks ago, instead of putting the Chinese flag, the AFP actually put the logo of Taiwan. Nobody noticed it, but quietly, the logo of Taiwan replaced the Chinese flag. And when Duterte bragged about ISIS leaders in the recent war in the South being killed by Chinese-made rifles, the military quietly said, no, it was American. So these kinds of small arms assistance in the AFP shows that Duterte cannot push, has a limit to his anti-Americanism when it comes to the military's needs. Not that Duterte hasn't tried to win the military from being pro-American. There's an effort to pay, largesse has been given to generals in the last few months. There is also an effort to shape and reshape the promotion of officers. So that's the first institutional obstacle to Duterte is anti-Americanism. The second institutional obstacle to Duterte is actually the Philippine diplomatic corps. Okay? It is common knowledge, for example, that the Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs has very few, if not one or two China or Russian experts. What is it? Its focus of the Philippine embassies and consulate is not so much strategic issues but economic. They are mainly there to serve the 12 million Filipinos that work abroad, that bring in as much as 23.9 billion a year of remittances. So they are not concerned then if you shift toward China and Russia, where there are no Filipino workers, the Department of Foreign Affairs would likely de-emphasize it or send the least bright of their people. So, so I doubt that if the country's foreign affairs officers will give important value publicly actually on what Duterte wants to happen in the United States. In regard to Japan, it's what people would say the same old, Japanese Overseas Development, JICA, Japanese ODA, has risen. It's focused in infrastructure. But what's interesting is the quiet thing that JICA is doing in the Philippine South. As most of you are familiar, there is a Muslim insurgency in the Philippine South that has become more complicated with the entry of ISIS in that part. The insurgency has been compromised, there's now negotiation between the More Islamic Liberation Front and the Philippine government, and one of the facilitators there is JICA, one or two JICA officers, and occasional representative from the Defense Ministry. Prime Minister Abe has also expanded Japanese aid to fighting terrorism by supplying patrol boats and radars, monitoring systems, not for China, but to monitor entry of terrorist groups in the South. In regards to ASEAN, Duterte has not made any changes. He has followed the principle of non-interference. He has reversed the policy of his predecessor, President Aquino, to push ASEAN to take a stand against China, and also to demand for to enhance the power of the ASEAN Human Rights Commission. He will not do that. He has backed out. And I think the reason for this is economic. Chinese investment in the Philippines may be small, but most of these investments are in Mindanao, or in export crops and fish, most of which go to China as a market. So this is the portrait of the picture, the overall picture, the Philippines in relation to the U.S., Japan, and ASEAN. As to what the problem, the question of what problems, domestic and international, the Philippines will face in the future, we can set it aside for discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Abenales. Look, we have some time, and I was asked to kick off a few questions, but these presentations, and I know they've been distributed, are so rich. I hope you'll take a look, and when we get to Q&A, ask more specific ones. But I want to return to the theme of this event. The theme of this event is the United States, Japan, and Southeast Asia in this post-summit evaluation. So it's going to be slightly deliberately on the edge in terms of provocation for our four panels. But let me ask four questions, and I'd ask each of them to sort of take a wing at. First, let's use the proposition that Japan is the winner in this post-summit context. Why? So let me make the case. First, the president adopted the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is essentially a Prime Minister Abe idea, as Koga-san mentioned, laid out in Kenya at the TCAT conference. The second is Japan is now in both of the key economic integration efforts in the region, RCEP and TPP 11. However long you think that is going to take, or how full it will be, or what elements of TPP will be suspended, or how long RCEP will take, let's posit the notion that Japan's in both. And it has a very rich ODA. The third way in which Japan is a winner, if you will, for the sake of this discussion, is it's the alternative to the China juggernaut, right? If the U.S. is not, and I don't accept this, I'm simply saying, if the U.S. is not going to play a big role, is going to focus on bilateral. So question one is Japan the winner? Second, does this, because Japan is a winner, does this intensify Sino-Japanese competition in Southeast Asia as the two main players that are offering alternative visions of order, geography, organization, institutions, and rules and norms? I don't know, but I ask you this from the vantage point of US, Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The third question, what does this do to US-Japan relations? One of the most interesting things about Southeast Asia in the US-Japan relationship in the post-45 era is that Japan has entered Southeast Asia primarily, but not only, it's never that simple, when the US has been less active in the region. So in the 70s, very heavily after the Plaza Accords in '85, and then once again, more recently, largely out of maritime concerns. And in fact, the US and Japan over the last few years, both in the context of alliance improvements, such as the guidelines and et cetera, but also in terms of joint statements and the fact sheets that have been done in the US-Japan bilateral context, to put Southeast Asia as part of their major cooperative elements. So where do we go now if the US and Japan are approaching it quite differently? And the fourth and final question I'd ask my colleagues to consider is, what happened to Southeast Asia? As Koga-sensei alluded, in fact, the Indo-Pacific and Prime Minister Abe's security diamond had no geographic place for Southeast Asia. It was focused on the four quadrants, or the four corners: India, Australia, Japan, and the US. So does this make Southeast Asia more or less important in this context? And how so? And for the US, of course, and forgive me, you were there at the creation of this policy, Colin, but one of the things that was flagged for us outsiders of the government was that the US policy under the rebalance or the pivot was that we were rebalancing within the rebalance, and the rebalancing was to Southeast Asia. So if Southeast Asia is missing from our views, what happened to Southeast Asia? So those are my four kind of deliberately slightly provocative questions for the panel, and then we can move, of course, to our colleagues in the room to follow on. Who wishes to start? Yes, Colin, please.
Sure. I'll just try to run through them really quickly. On the question of whether or not Japan is the winner, I'm not sure there are any winners yet. So much of this is largely amorphous and undefined. I still don't have a clear idea of like what this whole Indo-Pacific idea means. It's something that people have talked about for a very long time, but have struggled, I think, to identify exactly what we hope to accomplish on such a broad geographic scale. Like, there are bits and pieces here, but when you get all these countries in a room together, there aren't all that many points of sort of connection. But I do think, like, wow, how far has Japan come in the last 5 years or so, right? I mean, when Prime Minister Abe came to power, they were in a much different position. And sort of tying that into the question about sort of Japan's interest in Southeast Asia, and is it when the U.S. isn't there, Japan is. I don't really think that's it. I don't think it's like a Japan-U.S. rivalry. I think that Prime Minister Abe came to power at a time when, one, the United States was pivoting to Asia, but saw a confluence of strategic interests similar to what the United States saw, in the sense of you have a rising power in China, you have sort of a number of emerging points of conflict, and by and large, in the preservation of sort of peace, stability, a transparent, fair, rules-based order, Southeast Asia, Japan, the United States, even Korea, had a common interest. And you had a prime minister in Japan who was in a position and interested in sort of being more aggressive in pursuing those common interests and in forging a relationship. So I don't necessarily think it intensifies anyone's rivalry. It reflects sort of a commonality of the way leaders thought about things. On the question of where is Southeast Asia, that's really a question, I think, for Southeast Asia. I don't think really that there's necessarily conflict between, the Quad or the sort of U.S., Australia, Japan trilat and an ASEAN-centric sort of multilateral institutions. But ASEAN itself does not have a sense of its own objectives, a sense of its own identity. It doesn't know what it wants. And so it knows it wants to be at the center of the regional architecture. It knows it wants to sort of be the leader, because if it isn't, then it'll get left behind. But it doesn't have the same commonality of purpose that it has at other points in its history. And I don't want to overstate that, because it's always been a pretty disparate group. But in recent years, I mean, we've seen time and time again that even on sort of basic fundamental principles that are frankly already codified in their charter and in all of their foundational documents, they cannot, as a unit, agree on what its priorities are, what its objectives are, and what ASEAN leadership means. And so in the absence of a clear objective, it is, I think, falling by the wayside as others jump in. And I like I said, I don't think they're necessarily in conflict. I don't think the fact that they had one Quad meeting means that sort of the democracies are going to take over, because they have a lot of internal sort of differences as well. But I do think that ASEAN has sort of an identity crisis of its own that it's very aware of, but hasn't yet been able to deal with.
Thank you very much. Colin, Koga-san, do you want to?
Yes, I basically agree with you for the first 2 points, the Japan winner. I think it's Japan is the initiator, but it's not. It actually remains to be seen whether Japan is going to be the winner or not. Japan definitely provided the alternatives to think about the region and also the future direction of the political and then the economic cooperation in the Pacific. But then it does not necessarily mean it's successful. So I think over time we will figure out what's gonna happen. And then this is actually the second point was also this is good for the Southeast Asia, because now Southeast Asia countries could see the different alternative strategies that they could actually pick and choose. So for example, China providing the BRI, Japan is actually providing the kind of Indo-Pacific strategy, and then some of them actually benefits some of the Southeast Asian countries. So in that sense, they can actually choose and then they can actually let China and Japan compete with each other in peacefully. And
so the competition helps Southeast Asia. Look, okay.
Yeah. And then the third one, the U.S.-Japan relations, I thought about it, and then I think the U.S.-Japan the cooperation is gonna be, it's strong. I think as long as if we just look at the bilateral relations, I think the Japan and the United States remains kind of strong ally, and also enhance its cooperation. But then what is going to be different is probably the scope of alliance. So over time, since the 1990s, we actually try to expand the role of the alliances to reach out the region, and also the cooperation at the global level. But now, because the current administration in the United States is more narrowly bilateral also. So maybe alliance scope is going a little bit kind of narrowed down, and then maybe the core defense of Japan is intact. But then probably the scope on region and also global area might be actually not that really important. So that is my kind of speculation. And then fourthly, what happened to the Southeast Asia? I think again, I'm not sure, but then there is gonna be a kind of one way to think about non-marginalization of Southeast Asia, even if the Japan, the United States pursues the Indo-Pacific strategy. The reason is because the Southeast Asia basically focuses on the East Asia. which is the Northeast Asia and then the Southeast Asia, and then some of the countries outside area like the United States and so. So if they actually maintain that the pivotal role in that region, then they may be happy with that. Even if the United States or the Japan or China actually play a major role in the broader area, as long as the ASEAN maintains its kind of pivotal role in the narrower East Asia, then I think like it would be they might be happy. Because at the end of the day, the ASEAN kind of concerns are twofold. One is the political marginalization by the great powers, and then secondly, it's kind of opposite, but the ASEAN countries want to maintain its autonomy, political autonomy. They don't want to get intruded by the great powers much, but like, they want to attract the great power attention too. So as long as they can maintain that, probably like the other things are fine.
Thank you very much indeed. Alex,
Yes.
thoughts?
Yeah, so I also agree that I don't think that Japan is a winner. Although I think Japan has risen to a leadership position with last week the new TPP, which is now called CPTPP, and the Quad meeting in Manila. I think Japan has stepped up to fill in the vacuum that the Trump administration has created in Asia. It's a leadership by necessity. It's not. So I also don't see the U.S.-Japan's kind of leadership rivalry. I don't think there's a rivalry. Just because Japan, the United States withdraw, and then Japan has to step in. And I think Prime Minister Abe is very proactive in asserting Japan's leadership in there. So I think so that leads us to two things: TPP and Indo-Pacific concept. I also agree when we looked at the Da Nang speech by President Trump, you don't really see the content of the Indo-Pacific dream that he announced there. But for the Vietnamese, they are happy with, the Vietnamese press is very happy because they saw there is a sentence in Trump's speech saying that Vietnam is at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, and if you so I looked at the joint statements of three countries when Trump went to South Korea and Vietnam and Philippines, and I see that the Vietnamese are very amenable, very receptive of the new idea, even though they didn't really know what does that mean. So the Vietnamese press they don't know how to correctly translate Indo-Pacific into Vietnamese, so they translate it as India and Pacific Ocean, which is not the real the idea. And then in the joint statement, the correct Vietnamese translation was Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So you have that kind of, nobody knows in Vietnam. However, the joint statement between the U.S. and Vietnam last week, in there you see the Indo-Pacific was mentioned twice, and it was the two leaders discussed XYZ in the Indo-Pacific region. There's no mentioning of the Asia-Pacific. So completely the Vietnamese kind of jumped on the Trump bandwagon with the Indo-Pacific idea, even though they don't know what does that mean. When Trump went to South Korea, President Moon Jae-in, kept the distance from the Indo-Pacific. And so if you look at the joint statement, joint press release, you can see that it was just only President Trump says something about Indo-Pacific, but President Moon didn't say anything. And then you go to Philippines, and there's a joint statement between the two presidents, and then you see only one mentioning of Asia-Pacific, so no mention of Indo-Pacific at all. So they go back to, probably because Duterte doesn't want to embrace the idea of Indo-Pacific, so you see Asia-Pacific again in the joint statement with Philippines. So that anecdote says something about Vietnamese reception, of the Trump new strategy. And also, so that's Indo-Pacific. But TPP, if you look at the press, you can see the Vietnamese are really positive about, but reality is not. Because the Vietnamese, actually, they put a lot of hope on TPP with the United States. They want to be in TPP because of the United States. They want to get access to the US market, and also they want to have a bloc, that can counterbalance China. So now with the United States no longer in TPP, all of the value of the TPP for Vietnam is gone. You know, they have paid a high price with labor conditions and intellectual property rights and a lot of the concessions that they have made in TPP 12 just because they want to get access to the U.S. market and they want the U.S. in TPP. Now the years is gone. They're no longer enthusiastic about TPP anymore. So they have frozen a lot of things in this new TPP, but the Vietnamese is just there for the show because they are the host. So they have to be there. But the information that I get from Vietnam is that they think the TPP, the new TPP, will get years to get concluded. And so that's Vietnamese. But at the same time, they also have RCEP, regional cooperation of, economic program with China. RCEP is an alternative for TPP? No, for the Vietnamese, it's not an alternative for TPP. Nothing is an alternative for TPP because the U.S. not in any of them. So the Vietnamese attitude is wait and see. Okay, I'm going to be there, but just for the show. They are not pushing neither RCEP or TPP, even TPP 11. So what's their alternative? They don't even know. So they are still shocked, very shocked with the U.S. withdrawal from TPP, and also with the Trump administration, switching from multilateral to bilateral approaches. And they still don't know how to come up with the new reality. But I think in the future, the Vietnamese will be very happy with the Quad because they have very, very good relationship with any of the Quads. Japan, India, Australia as well. When they have some, a lot of issues with China, also some issues with the United States. But for the Vietnamese, the most comfortable partners that they have in the world are Japan and India, not even some ASEAN countries. So they will be, I think they will be very happy with the Quad, but they are not going to join the Quad as a formal kind of partner, but they will, coordinate their activities with each of the Quads individually, so bilaterally, but they would be very happy to see Indo-Pacific has become a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy and Quad becoming a more viable kind of architecture when ASEAN is actually useless for Vietnamese to solve the South China Sea issue.
Thanks very much indeed. But before you're the last speaker before we turn to the audience.
I live in an academic life, so one of the couple of things that I observed vis-a-vis Japan and the U.S. and Southeast Asia is very much framed by this. Two things. There is a strong academic group within Japan that wants to strengthen Japan and Southeast Asian ties to counter China. And you can see this in a couple of things. One is quietly the Japanese a couple of years ago introduced multiple re-entry visas for Thais, Filipinos, and Indonesians. Thailand and Indonesia, where the biggest Japanese investments are. Filipinos because of English. Filipinos are the fourth preferred foreign wife of Japanese farmers. But also nursing and English. But there's also big hospitality, entertainment industry in Japan. They've quietly done this, but also in recognition that Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia are fast-growing economies. The second thing they've done is increase the number of scholarships for Southeast Asians compared to scholarships given to non-Southeast Asians, in recognition of the fact that the United States has now increasingly incapable of supporting the scholarship. The joke is, it's not Fulbright anymore, it's half-bright. So the Japanese are coming in that. The third thing that's very interesting about the Southeast Asian trade is that you have to look at not so much the Japanese government's movement, but the movement of the Zaibatsus, Mitsui and Mitsubishi. Two powerful corporations that actually dictate policy in Southeast Asia. The joke is, during the time of General Suharto, Mitsubishi would know what is in General Suharto's table before the General Suharto knows what is in it. So that's the powerful thing. The other, in relation to the United States, the quiet thing that I've observed, I was at Kyoto University for 10 years. Two things that were happening. One is where the U.S. cannot perform actively but Japan recognizes that the U.S. is a political hegemon. So it enters in areas where the U.S. cannot function well. So one of the fascinating things, for example, that was happening was when the U.S. Was critical of the stance. There was an increase in the number of enrollments from scholarship given to people from citizens of Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and everything. I taught these guys. It's very funny. So these are, you feel it in where the U.S. is not. There's also an effort to reach out to Africa. And so institutions like the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies in Tokyo do not have the minority of, the most minority are Western students. You can actually see a lot of students coming from the third world. And finally, where the U.S., for example, is unable to come in because of domestic politics. Okay? Like, for example, 9/11, where Japan would come in and say, in case of 9/11, for example, Saudi money didn't know where to go because the U.S. was closed. One of the investments of Saudi money was in the university system. So in those areas, I think, you have Japan has quietly, not so much assert itself, complement the United States in these things. On Southeast Asia, I think it's a very, very influential presence.
Thank you very much, Jojo. We have time now for opening it up, so I believe the way it works is that you tell us who you are and your affiliation, and there are microphones circulating from our colleagues. So who would like to start by raising a question or comment? Or yes, sir, in the back there, please.
Stand up. Paul Midford, Norwegian University for Science and Technology, and a visitor here at Sasakawa. My question, I think, for perhaps all of you, but perhaps also particularly Ms. Willett and Dr. Koga, maybe the moderator as well, is in the past there's been this discussion, discourse, dialogue, or claims that security multilateralism in East Asia, like the ARF and the ADMM+, are somehow in tension with the U.S. alliance. That in the 90s it was said by someone in Washington that Japan was being distracted from the alliance by this. Or that in other ways there was some tension and that it was hard to do them both at once. So my question is, was that ever true? And is it still true today? And if it's not true, then on the other hand, are there potentials for synergy in terms of regional security between the ARF and the ADM+ on the one hand and the U.S.-Japan alliance on the other? And what would those synergies be? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Colin, would you like to start? And I know others may have thoughts on this. Kay, you've done a lot of work in this area as well as.
It's an interesting question. I think from an American perspective, there is not, I think, tension between the sort of multilateral security cooperation and the alliances. The alliances are much, I don't know, deeper, stronger, longer standing, and can go much further in what we can do together. Multilateral security cooperation in Asia is nascent. It is largely discussions. There's not a lot of practical applications of it because people aren't all that comfortable with bringing their actual military together. I mean, which is reflected in the fact, for example, the ARF is actually a Ministry of Foreign Affairs thing, right? I mean, you're talking about security issues, but none of the security forces are there. That is changing, and we are seeing, for example, with the ADMM+, with more intelligence forums, we're actually seeing some exercises, but this is all really baby steps. You're seeing much more on the alliance side, and then some like what they call mini-lat cooperation, where you have a small number of partners, usually pulled from the bigger group, that have a common interest in maritime security or counterterrorism, that are able to do more. but the whole groups are very rarely able to do much more than talk on security issues. The one area where I would say that there is some tension is that, particularly in the EAS, a little bit less so in the ARF because it's Ministries of Foreign Affairs, is there are a couple of countries in East Asia that are deeply antagonistic towards the US alliance system and use the multilateral forums to attempt to weaken the alliances and to get sort of general agreement in Asia that alliances are bad. Now, that's not terribly successful, but it does inject some tension into the proceedings on occasion. Yeah. In terms of synergies, sure. I mean, I think particularly, as we've noted, where there are these sort of mini-lat areas of cooperation, I think that the ability to do more on a multilateral security cooperation when it gets to the point of being more practical, having the alliances, having a number of countries that are used to working together and can help fund it, help train, can provide personnel, I think that'll be helpful. But while we're still sort of in this very nascent phase of the multilateral security cooperation, there's not that much. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. That is interesting. And then I basically agree with the notion that there is not like really a tension between the multilateralism and also the security the alliances, because again, like multilateralism is security multilateralism is pretty nascent, and then they don't really they are pretty much focused on the confidence building rather than the kind of hardcore like the traditional security issues. Even if they do some defense cooperation, that is more focused on the non-traditional security issues such as anti-piracy, HADR, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief, and search and rescue, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, as the United States understands the relationship between the alliance and then security multilateralism in 1990s, it's more kind of complementary. The alliance issues could deal with the traditional security, while the non-traditional, the multilateral security forum can deal with the confidence building issue and also the non-traditional security issues. And I think, yes, ADMM and ADMM Plus is basically it's more geared toward the ASEAN, and then ASEAN centrality is really, really intact. Even though the so-called plus countries in ASEAN ADMM, which are the 8 countries of outside the ASEAN, involved in this framework, ASEAN has the kind of central power to make the kind of agenda setting and then also other things. And then what they are aiming at is they are trying to get the resources and then also the capacity building programs and those kind of things from the external actors. So it's more like the ASEAN as a concentric, and then the other external actors providing the ASEAN some capacity. So in that sense, it's not actually the multilateral security framework that can be functioned as the kind of collective security or collective self-defense.
Alex or Patricia, would you have any comments on this topic? Paul, I'll just add one thing. As I recall from the history, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you were still in the government at that time, our allies were some of the strongest proponents of the United States being at multilats and wanting us to be not isolated from them. And if I'm also not mistaken, some of the Asian multilats are the ones the US joined later than most of our allies. That is to say, EAS was up and running prior to us. So if you think about this structurally, our allies were kind of, if you will, incentivizing us and pulling us in to say, we need you here. They did not see that at all as a problem with the alliances, but rather a demonstration of American engagement and involvement in setting the norms and rules as well as the balance of power. Who's next? Yes, sir, please.
My name is Larry Greenwood, president of the Japan Society. of Northern California in San Francisco. Just hold it. Okay, sorry. My question had to do, I guess I'd be interested in whoever has views on Okay, thanks. With the change in Japan of the reinterpretation of the Constitution to allow collective defense and the ability to export arms, but my question was how Japan is using, and Prime Minister Abe is using that to create stronger defense cooperation ties in Southeast Asia, and particularly military to military. And also, are there potential for doing new things with the United States with these new authorities that they could do jointly in Southeast Asia? And kind of a third question that's related would be, what would countries like Vietnam, for example, and the Philippines, how would they view that kind of joint cooperation? Would it be considered positive or negative?
Thank you very much, Mr. Greenwood. Those are terrific questions. Okay, would you, because of the question coming out of the Japanese Constitution,
Okay, yeah.
perhaps you could start and then we'll have others respond, of course.
All right. So thank you very much again. Very quickly, I think it could. Even though the Prime Minister Abe reinterpreted the Constitution to exercise the right to collect self-defense, there are many still hurdles, like political hurdles. So it's not actually the kind of things that Japan can exercise a right to collective collective self-defense with the other countries rapidly. So it takes a little bit time to coordinate and also manage how and when Japan actually could do this kind of use the right to collective self-defense. That said, this actually reinterpretation creates a window of opportunity for Japan to cooperate further with the other countries without kind of using creating the alliances. So, for example, if Japan actually considered there is a kind of grave threat to its survival and also grave threat to its its survival, then Japan could actually cooperate with the other countries to defend itself by the kind of threat coming from the outside. So in that sense, I think there are many options that Japan could have right now. But then the problem is that when and how we can actually do this, because there are three conditions for using the collective self-defense. The one is basically similar to the self-defense individual self-defense conditions too, but there should be some kind of the immediate threat to the Japan's survival, and then also there should be no other means to counter those kind of threats, and then it actually they have to without cooperation with other countries, then Japan is going to face the kind of devastating damage from those kind of threats. Under these conditions, the Japan can only exercise the right to collective self-defense. So, but then again, this is based on the kind of political decision. So, even though it's opened the window of opportunity for Japan to cooperate more intensively with the other countries other countries, except for the United States, still there are a long way to actually go for the furthering cooperation.
Can I just add a little bit to
Please.
that?
And particularly on the U.S.-Japan, what we can do together kind of
Yeah, I think the collective self-defense decisions are important, but I also would emphasize that a lot of the security cooperation and assistance that Southeast Asia needs isn't really military. A lot of it is sort of civilian, whether it's Coast Guard, it's law enforcement, it's sort of counterterrorism, and most of this can be done outside of military channels. In fact, I think Vietnam actually changed the way it handles its Coast Guard explicitly so we could do more with Japan to help them build up that maritime law enforcement capability. So when you're talking about maritime domain awareness, fisheries enforcement, counterterrorism, a lot of these fall into sort of civilian law enforcement functions that don't have any restrictions on them. A bit of the challenge is that our Department of Defense has a lot more money than our FBI or our Department of Homeland Security.
Or Coast Guard.
Yeah, or Coast Guard. Like, don't even get me started. But that's our constraint, not theirs. And I think a lot of the sort of the security threats that these countries face, the collective self-defense thing is sort of a separate issue, and we can do a tremendous amount and do a tremendous amount together through the sort of civilian law enforcement functions.
Alex and Jojo, would you like to comment a sort of Southeast Asian perspective on this?
Following that, there's actually an active police training collaboration within Japan and countries like Indonesia and Thailand, and that's security, no? Japan has also stepped in peace processes. In the Philippine South, for example, the international monitoring system that makes sure that there are no ceasefire violations between the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the More Islamic Liberation Front includes the Japanese. And it counterbalances it because it actually is an interesting combination because you have an American, somebody from Brunei, Malaysia, Japan, and Indonesia, I think. The US has withdrawn, I think, but you have that. You have a Japanese presence there, and that's where they're investing, being able to be a major actor in peace-building processes and conflict negotiation.
Yes, as Colin said, yes. So from the Vietnamese perspective, the immediate need for them is more in the law enforcement area than the high-tech military. And so after the 2014 incident with China and the oil crisis, Japan offered to give Vietnam 6 vessels. And the Vietnamese Coast Guard and the fishery surveillance, which is also doing law enforcement duties in the South China Sea, also received the ships from Japan. Vietnam is also looking for buying some sort of maritime surveillance aircraft, and the inclination is that they want to buy it from Japan rather than from the United States, even though Japan has the second-hand aircraft. But more generally, I think the prospect for defense cooperation between Vietnam and Japan is very, very rosy. Japan has become the second country after Russia only to get access to the military installation in Cam Ranh Bay. So the same day as Xi Jinping went to Vietnam for a state visit in November 2015, a few hours before that, Japan's defense minister Gen Nakatani came to Cam Ranh Bay to start his visit to Vietnam in that year. During that visit, he signed an agreement with the Vietnamese to get access to Cam Ranh Bay for the Japanese Navy vessels and aircraft. To receive refueling and replenishment at Cam Ranh Bay. So I think generally it's very positive.
And just to emphasize Colin's point, I mean, Japan has played such an important role in building up the heads of Asian Coast Guards agencies process. Also, much, if I'm not mistaken, and I was looking into this quite a bit of detail, I don't believe Japan has made a single patrol boat or vessel transfer to a foreign navy, only to Coast Guards and Marine police and other activities. So it's very interesting that it's been done through strategic use of ODA and other vehicles rather than mill to mill. And there's a lot of inter-ministry and interagency differences about how to do this within Tokyo, as I understand. Who's next? Yes, sir. Admiral Blair.
I'd like to pursue a little bit the point that Ms. Willits raised in the beginning of this is the first Southeast Asian set of meetings I can recall in which South China Sea maritime disputes did not play a big role, and you mentioned that, but number one, how did that happen? Because all the countries were sort of used to that over the time, and number two, what does it mean? Does it mean sort of a period of non-military competition in the South China Sea, which would be a good thing? Is it just a pause in China's actions, and China will say, oh, well, nobody wants to talk about it, I guess I can make a few more moves here without unified opposition from the United States, Japan, all the ASEAN countries, and others. I still haven't quite digested, because it was a very large dog that did not bark at this meeting. So, Ms. Willis, maybe you could start us and then hear from the others.
Sure. I'll give it a shot anyway. I think a couple of things. One is that I do think that the sort of big construction projects are largely finished. I do think that that when people say, oh, well, there's not much going on, they are deploying, assets. They're continuing to build up buildings. There's still quite a bit of activity going on in developing the Chinese outposts in the South China Sea, but the sort of days of like opening up your newspaper and like, oh, suddenly there's a new sort of 40-kilometer square island in the middle of the ocean that wasn't there yesterday, though that's kind of past. So things have quieted down a little bit. Frankly, China has effectively chosen not to pick a new fight by deploying another oil rig or blocking a resupply of Filipino outposts. There's been a little bit of that, but nothing on the scale that we saw for several years. And Southeast Asia's, or ASEAN's, I should say, not all South, reaction to that has essentially been to let sleeping dogs lie. And I think that when the claimants themselves are not actively pushing the issue, it's difficult for their friends and allies to do so. That said, I do think that the fact that we've had a change in administration in the United States matters quite a bit too. I have to admit to being a little bit surprised, because I still really wonder what the policy is. Secretary Tillerson's confirmation hearing, he basically came out and said we should blockade the South China Sea from the Chinese, which to my mind is bonkers, but he said that, and he seemed to have a very strong feeling about what was right and what wasn't in the South China Sea. That has essentially been dropped, as far as I can see. When Secretary Tillerson or Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of Defense or the President of the United States, it is not coming up at all. And I think that's really telling. They're not mentioning UNCLOS. They do occasionally talk about freedom of navigation, and the one activity we have seen is regular freedom of navigation operations. My personal interpretation of what's going on is that without incidents to respond to, without other claimants actively asserting their claims, the United States is, and with the current administration's focus on, frankly, America first, the focus is on protecting United States freedom of navigation in that waterway, and it's not on upholding UNCLOS, it's not on preserving sort of a rules-based order. Some of these more theoretical principles, and it's much more on just as long as we're able to operate, we're pretty much okay. I think it's probably a mistake, but I do think that's sort of where this is going.
Others, please.
Yeah, so I think the root cause is the pro-status quo approach that most of the countries outside of China, the United States and Japan, and also other countries in Southeast Asia are pursuing. If you focus on status quo, then China is exploiting that approach to just change the status quo every day a little bit. And so that's the salami slicing tactic to change status quo without triggering a major backlash or major reaction to that. And so the attitude right now is that with China's new normal in South China Sea, we have the artificial islands and everything else, but we are just resign to accept it as a new normal and just hope that China will not provoke us to another incident. And so that's the attitude. And also I think however, things still happening in the South China Sea. For example, this year in the summer, the Vietnamese resumed drilling in an area close to the Spratly Island, and China sent out several ships there to confront the Vietnamese. And then Vietnamese just have to postpone the drilling, and withdraw their vessels. So the two countries, they deal with that, not to get, so very different from the way the Vietnamese reacted to China's deployment of the IRIC in 2014. They made it a huge international event, but this time nobody knows. So I think that's probably because the United States doesn't show its interest really, and its resolve in dealing with the South China Sea issue. And when people in Southeast Asia looked at the Trump administration, they see him focusing on North Korea and the trade with China, and they don't see the chance for him to come to the South China Sea to back them up. And so what they are going to do is just, okay, so they have to try to find some modus vivendi, some accommodation with China. So that's a logical response from those small countries.
Well, the Philippine military's joke is to stand in Spratlys with their American counterpart and say, if I shoot them, will you defend us? And the Americans actually are worried about that because there are elements in the Philippine military that really, even if it's a weaker position, would like to assert Philippine sovereignty. It's lessened now, reduced now because of Duterte's pro-China policy, but it's still there. The big problem for the Philippines is its main threat is domestic. There was an effort to reorient the Marines under President Aquino to turn it into an external defense force, but the emergence of ISIS in the south has made it difficult for Marines to sustain that. They've shifted back to their old role of a counterinsurgency force. But the challenge is still there. I mean, military officials when I give orientation in the Philippines, in Pearl Harbor, they always say, well, that's what we're scared about. If the Filipinos start shooting, will we come to their aid? And the position is we have to come to their aid. But it's a political question, of course.
Oh, sorry, Kate. Please.
Adding to these comments, the ASEAN is not completely silent, actually. When you look at the ASEAN-China joint statement, they actually mentioned now the South China Sea is calm, but then we should not take it for granted. So that means there might be some other kind of incident happen, and in that sense, we need to be really careful about it. So again, this is just additional. I agree with what the other people said, but then there's still kind of skepticism about this quietness.
Well, we have time. I think we had one gentleman over here. Is there anyone else? I don't want to miss anyone at this very late stage. Okay, so the last question, sir, please.
Hi, I'm Taishu Pitt from the Congressional Study Group on Japan. I wanted to see if your evaluation on the Chinese national, the slogan on the community of shared destiny, and how that might change the security alliance in the region, and what sort of challenges do you see that facing?
Who'd like to take up China's approach? And please.
So I think if I understand it correctly, China is focusing on the kind of non-alliance, and then China actually try to create the non-aligned kind of a partnership with many countries. And then I think this doesn't really have any kind of friction with the other countries' policy, because if we take a look at the trend in the post-Cold War era, not many, or basically all countries, or no country actually creates a new alliance to target one country. So in that sense, I think the Chinese the slogan of the Community of the Shared Destiny is pretty much describing the current trend, and then also at the same time they try to criticize the the U.S. alliance network existing since the Cold War. But then that is just the general comments that that China usually has, and then I don't think it has the really big impact on the alliances.
Anyone else on this? Yes, please, Alex.
Yeah, I think China is trying to re-establish a neo tributary relationship with the countries in Asia. And it's very different from the way the United States or any other Western powers dealing with other countries, because it's very much Chinese. It's a hierarchical kind of view in which, remember when Yang Jiechi, told Singaporean foreign minister at the ARF meeting in 2010 in Hanoi that China is a big country and all of you are small countries, and that's the fact. So China is trying to reestablish that new tributary relationship, and their reception, very positive reception from Asia as well. For example, last week, President Duterte, was interviewed by some people, and he said that when he meet with Xi Jinping at the EAS meeting, he will ask him whether China wants to control the South China Sea or still give us free passage. And so that is the attitude of somebody asking a big brother to allow us. That is not in the U.S. thinking, because the U.S. thinking is you have the law and you have to follow the law. And so even if you are my enemy, I still need to give you the rights of the law. You are entitled to the law. So it's not somebody grant you access to some areas, but it's the law. So but however the thinking in Asia is that you have people like that, and they accept that, and they think that okay, so that sort of a tributary relationship is the best way for them, smaller country, to live with China forever. So I stop at this.
Thank you very much. Well, Kazuo gave us a few more extra minutes, but let me add my thanks to Sasakawa USA, to Ambassador Jim Zumwalt, to Admiral Blair, and Ms. Chano for hosting this wonderful program today. And I just want to make a point that 3 of our panelists have traveled very far to come here. And I just wanted to highlight that Kay came from Singapore last night, and Alex and Patricio came not so far as far as Singapore, but from Hawaii and to the winter East Coast. So they all deserve a special hand. And of course, Colin for her wonderful experience and also addition to this program. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.